Hello, my name is Peter Maloney, Secretary of the Newport Historical Society and a member of the Newport 300 Committee. We have been supported by the Mayo County Council Community Heritage Grant Scheme 2021 and the Heritage Council to produce a family tree for the town of Newport based on the census of 1911. We hope to have all the people in the town in 1911 have a family tree completed for them. I'd like to thank Mike Ashley very much for helping with taking the photographs for this presentation. It's being uploaded to YouTube as part of Heritage Week contribution from Newport 300. The family trees will be available on newportmayo300.com/genealogy. And the sources for the family tree would be the Valuation Office Cancellation books, which I've been researching for the last 10 years and will give information on each of the houses in Meddlicott Street. The 1911 census, which will also link with these houses and say who was living there in 1911. irishgenealogy.ie will give births, marriages and deaths for the people that were living in these houses. Two page sites, Ancestry.co.uk and findmypast.ie have been used, as also two free ones, wikitree.com and familysearch.org. And then some people's names I put into google.com and found some interesting. So the family tree for Meddlicott Street is at newportmayo300.com/genealogy Meddlicott Street. And the project will be completed by Friday the 29th of October 2021. More details on the people living in the street in a book published by the Newport 300 Committee, Newport 300, the first 200 years, 1720 to 1920. Here are some photographs which we have found of old pictures of Meddlicott Street from the National Library Orem Photographs Archives in UCD. Here you can see the back of the houses in Meddlicott Street, taken from up on the hill above them. And this is from down the Malcolm Road, looking back, and you can see the what's known locally as the Blue House, which was the Church of Ireland School, and then Meddlicott Street in the distance beyond the two bows. Here's another view showing the dispensary doctor's house and some houses in Meddlicott Street past it. This house here now is fairly obscured. It's covered by ivy and is beside Joyce's garage. This is looking from Castlebar Street across the bridge and showing Meddlicott Street, the dispensary doctor's house and the Church of Ireland. Looking at the census of 1911, we can see the various people that are living in the houses, the head of the houses, and going from this dispensary doctor's house back towards the post office, we see in the first house was living Michael Joyce, a coach builder. The next house would be Honoria Moran, a publican. Maria Gibbons, aged 47, a shopkeeper. Jane Groves, 59, was born in County Cavan. James Kelly, a shoemaker. Patrick Larkin, an army pensioner. Timothy Hoban, an ex-blacksmith, and his family had continued on the tradition of blacksmithing. John Ellicott, a stonemason. Peter Paul McGee, a car driver from County Tyrone. Mary Cunningham, aged 72, and Mary Connor, aged 86. Patrick Malone was a baker. William Jordan, a tailor. Bridget Maloney, age 65, and Bridget Cunningham, age 55. John Maguire, age 49, a sergeant in the IRC, and Henry Moore, a labourer. Here's a map of the town of Newport, and you can see at the bottom of the map, you can see Meddlicott Street, and it's stretching from where it says Parochial Schoolhouse. That would be the Church of Ireland school, and then the new school would be the boys' school, which, as you notice on this map, there's no railway bridge, and the school is just right beside where the railway bridge crosses over, and is now the handball alley. So here we see the dispensary doctor's house. This picture was taken a couple of years ago, and it wasn't as overgrown then as it is now. So the people living in this house, this is based on the Valuation Office records. In 1850 there was a James Davis, a doctor, living there, and 20 years later the house was lived in by his son Hugh Davis, another doctor. And then in 1895 Miles Dexter Jordan was the dispensary doctor. In 1908 Michael Joyce had taken over the house, and in 1933 his son Patrick Joyce was the owner of the house. The family tree of James Davis is available on ancestry.co.uk, and by the time that the family tree is completed, we'll have that on our own website, as the address was. So in 1911, who was living in the house was Michael Joyce, aged 38, a coach builder, his wife Mary Joyce, aged 38, their son Patrick, aged 9, and the daughters Mary Hannah, aged 7, Bridget Josephine, aged 5, and Margaret, aged 3. The next house, where the garage is now, was just a yard that was associated with the dispensary, and there was no house there in 1911. But in 1911, this house was present. This is the Black Oak Inn and the hair saloon beside it. And looking on the Valuation office cancellation books for the house on the right, in 1850 Dodwell Brown was living there. In 1860 Anne Burke, 1861 Dodwell Brown again, 1870 Robert Ferris, 1902 John Moran, 1908 Nora Moran, and she was still living there in 1925. In 1930 John K. Moran was living there, and in 1940 George Reed. The family tree of Dodwell Brown is also available on ancestry.com. And in 1911, who was living in this house was Honoria Moran, aged 55, a publican, and also her cousin, Sarah Ross Malone, aged 17, a shop assistant. Here's the next house. And this house in the cancellation books, living in this house was Deborah Williamson in 1850, Christian Nielsen in 1870, John Bowl in 1873, Andrew Gibbons in 1874, Robert Ferris in 1887, Lizzie Coughlin in 1912 and 1922, Mary Cormack in 1928, and Mary McCormack in 1933. This was probably the same person. 1938, Patrick McCormack. And in 1911, living in this house was Jane Groves, aged 59, a widow of a railway porter. Her sons John Ed, aged 26, a general labourer, and Robert, aged 18, an apprentice carpenter, and her daughter Isabella, aged 21. The next house is number 7. So house number 7 in 1850 was unoccupied. 1864 Deborah Williamson was living in it. 1878 there were lodgers. 1907 Robert McAdams. 1915 John Stokes. 1946 Patrick Kilroy. 1952 Edward Kilroy, 1959 Bridget Hastings, and 1986 Patrick Kilroy. House number 8. Living in this house in 1850 was Dodwell Brown. 1852. Dodwell Brown probably owned the house. He mightn't be living in it because you might have noticed there was an earlier house on the street that Dodwell Brown also was down in the cancellation book as owning. So he may have let this house to tenants rather than living it in himself. 1852 John Malley. 1864 Stephen Flanagan. 1870 Thomas Malley. 1907 Robert McAdams. 1910 Patrick Daly. 1913 William McAdam. 1915 Patrick Daly. 1980 John Stokes. 1946 Patrick Kilroy. 1950 John J. Corbett, the chemist. 1951 Edward Kilroy. 1952 Mrs. Edith St. John. 1964 Martin Maguire. And 1977 Martin. This house was used as a workshop in 1911 by John Stokes, a scrap metal merchant. House number 9. This house, according to the cancellation books, in 1850 was living Thomas Flynn, 1866 Peter Heenahan, 1870 Thomas MacDonald, 1874 Martin McFadden, 1879 John Burke, 1896 and 1922 Bridget O'Connell, 1925 Mary Grady, and 1952 Miss B. Chambers. In the 1911 census, James Kelly, aged 37, a shoemaker, was living in this house with his wife Catherine, aged 35, and sons John Joseph, aged 6, James, aged 5, and Dominic, aged 4, and their daughter Bridget, aged 2. House number 10. In this house in 1850, Patrick Ryder was living. 1862, Peter Quinn. 1864, Patrick Ryder. 1866, William McCormick. 1868, William Sharkey. 1870, Dominic Gavin. 1874, Andrew Gibbons. 1879, Timothy Hoban. 1907, Robert McAdams. 1911, Patrick Daly. 1914, Robert McAdam. 1915, William Jordan. 1918, Hugh Jordan. 1937, Bridget Jordan. And 1947, Thomas Saunders. In 1911, living in the house was Patrick Larkin, aged 76, an army pensioner. His wife Honoria, aged 68. They'd been married for 14 years and had no children. The next house was number 11. If you'd like to stop and look at some of these slides or go back on them, just press the pause button on the video and you can look at each slide as it goes in reverse, and if there's a particular house that you're interested in, the website. In this house in 1850 lived William Toulis. In 1868, Eliza Williamson. 1870, John Gillard. 1874, Robert Gillard. 1878, James Davis. 1902, Timothy Hoban. 1907, Robert McAdams. 1910, Patrick Daly. 1925, Ellen Regan. 1928, James Doherty. 1963, Eamon Connolly. 1965, Sean Carter. And 1977, Michael O'Malley. The entries only go up to where the rates were abolished, so that's why they stop in the 1970s. In 1911, Timothy Hoban, aged 72, an ex-blacksmith, was living in the house, along with his wife Mary, aged 70, and their son Henry, aged 27, a blacksmith, and his wife, aged 22, a dressmaker. Henry's wife's name was Lizzie. Also living in the house was Timothy Hoban's daughter Julia, aged 30, and his grandson Anthony, aged 12. Now we come to the Growningwell pub, and there's been quite a bit of change done to this house. So this particular building here would have included houses 12, 13, 14, 15 and 16. So looking at 12, there'd be 1850 was Neil O'Donnell, 1865 Conall O'Donnell, 1866 William McFadden, 1870 Michael Cleary, 1874 Timothy Hoban, 1888 Tatey Gorman, 1882 Brian Hard, and 1902 onwards was John Ellicott. John Ellicott, aged 43, was a stonemason. His wife Mary Ann was aged 39. Their sons John, aged 13, Thomas, aged 11, and William, aged 6. Also their daughters Mary Josephine, aged 10, Annie Teresa, aged 4, and Claire Mary, aged 11. Here's house number 13. 1850 Neil O'Donnell, lodgers. 1865 Conall O'Donnell, 1870 John Hearn, 1874 Constantine O'Donnell, 1902 John Ellicott, 1907 Charles Kavanagh, 1910 John Ellicott, 1940 Mary Ann Ellicott, 1945 Michael Chambers, 1950. Here's house number 14. 1850 Neil O'Donnell, 1865 John Healy, 1868 Patrick Ryder, 1868 Constantine O'Donnell, 1885 Mary O'Donnell, 1895 Patrick Kelly, 1913 Peter McGee, 1916 Henry Hoban, 1948 Elizabeth Hoban, 1954 Patrick Kelly, 1965 Sean Hoban, and 1967 Joseph. Living in the house in 1911 when the census was taken was Peter Paul McGee, aged 29, a car driver born in County Tyrone. His wife Bridget Agnes, aged 32, a national school teacher, and their daughter Mary Margaret, aged under 1 year. The next house, 15, is the post office, and living in it in 1852 was Richard Connor, 1866 Peter Gorman, 1870 Patrick Ryder, 1877 Ellen Morrison, 1879 Anthony Gorman, 1882 Neil Gorman, 1897 Charles J. Kavanagh, 1902 John Ellicott, and 1908 S. Cunningham. In 1911 Mary Cunningham, aged 72 and a widow, was living in the house. The post office was two houses made together to make the post office, and so house number 16 was the right-hand side, the left-hand side, and these are the people that were in the valuation office. 1850 Jane McGurk, 1877 Neil Gorman, 1882 James Craven, 1897 Charles J. Kavanagh, 1898 John Ellicott, 1901 Charles J. Kavanagh, 1908 S. Cunningham, 1914 Thomas Grady, 1915 Healy Brothers, 1928 Martin Healy, 1930 John Foy, 1934 Martin Healy, 1938 Sarah McManaman, and 1948 Joseph McManaman. The later entries in this compared to the previous entry for house number 15, 15 and 16 would have been combined, and that's why this entries just in this house number 15. This is the next house. Living in this house in 1850 was Reverend Matthew Flannelly, 1864 Dominic Quinn, 1865 Patrick Ryder, 1866 Edward Joyce, 1870 Thomas Gibbons, 1890 Constable Sullivan RIC, 1897 Charles J. Kavanagh, 1914 James Connor, 1936 Mrs. Lily Moore, 1967 James McGee, 1968 Edward Pole, 1971 Agnes. And living in the house in 1911 was Mary Connor, aged 86, and her daughter Mary Ann, aged 49, and her son James, aged 45, who was a bootmaker. House number 18. This house was owned in 1861 by James Kilroy, 1865 Michael Connor, 1868 Thomas McManaman, 1887 the widow of Thomas McManaman, 1899 Dominic McGovern, 1907 Francis O'Donnell, 1911 Patrick Malone, 1944 Mary Malone, and 1961 Matilda. The 1911 census showed that Patrick Malone, aged 46 and a baker, was living in the house with his wife Nora, aged 44. They'd been married for 25 years and had had 9 children, 4 of who were still alive and living with them. Michael, aged 24 and married, Peter, aged 23 and single, both who were also bakers. Also in their house were their son Joseph, aged 19, and daughter Nora, aged 18. House number 9. In 1861 living in this house was James Staunton, 1864 Alexander Locke, 1887 Mrs. MacDonald, 1911 Mrs. O'Malley, 1917 John Flynn, 1921 James Malloy, 1933 Jack O'Malley, and 1967 Thomas O'Malley. William Jordan, aged 35 and a tailor, who was single, was living in the house in 19. House number 20, the barber shop. 1861 living in the house was Michael Kelly, 1867 Anthony Jordan, 1870 Patrick Carey, 1871 Philip Watson, 1877 John Mahoney, 1880 Patrick Munnelly, 1911 Patrick Maloney, 1954 Miss Margaret Maloney, and 1987 Christy. According to the census, Bridget Maloney, aged 65 and a widow, would be married for 38 years and had had 6 children, all were still alive, was living in the house, with her son Patrick, aged 37 and single, a general labourer. Her daughters Maggie, aged 29 and single and a dressmaker, and Bridget, aged 26 and single. House number 21. This house was owned in 1861 by Thomas McManaman, 1868 by Patrick Carey, 1870 by Bartholomew Geary, 1871 by Patrick Munnelly, 1911 by Mrs. Cunningham, 1916 by Patrick McKay, 1933 by Lawrence David, 1944 by Julia David, and 1967 by Mrs. Julia Gibbons. In 1911, Bridget Cunningham, aged 55 and a widow, would be married for 35 years and had had 1 child who was no longer alive. Also in the house was Ellen Mulcrone, aged 74. The next house is number 22. And living in the house in 1850 was Anne Brown, 1861 Thomas Malley, 1861 Anne Malley, 1980 Bridget Donovan, 1923 Daniel G. Turley, 1925 Margaret Donovan, 1928 Bridget Donovan, 1933 John Donovan, 1941 Thomas J. Kelly, 1959. In the 1911 census, this property was uninhabited. House number 23. 1850, Mary Joyce. 1862, John O'Donnell. 1868, Dominic Malley. 1871, Margaret Chambers. 1877, Robert Ferris. 1879, James Hooks. 1884, James MacDonald. 1907, Anne Malley. 1908, Sergeant Heenahan of the RIC. 1923, John Maguire. 1941, Thomas J. Kelly. 1950, Francis Nealis. John Maguire, aged 49, a sergeant of the RIC who had been born in County Cavan, lived in this house in 1911 with his wife Emily, aged 35, their son John Joseph, aged 15, and daughters Kathleen Anna, aged 12, Mary Florence, aged 8, and Emily, aged 6. House number 23. In this house in 1914 lived Henry Moore, 1918 Mary Cunningham, 1923 Joseph Berg, 1926 Martin Kane, 1967 M.B. Gallagher, and 1986 Francis Nealis. In the census, living in the house in 1911 was Henry Moore, aged 43, a labourer, and his wife Ellen, aged 40. They'd been married for 4 years. The Meddlicott Street family tree is at the website newportmayo300.com, genealogy, and the project will be completed by Friday the 29th of October 2021. More details are in the book published by the Newport 300 Committee, Newport 300, the first 200 years, 1720 to 1920, which will be published before Christmas.